That is an air compressor. Exciting stuff. This is also an air compressor. A California Air Tools. Yes, okay. So, this little guy right here just has what looks like a polyurethane O-ring on it. There's a central bearing that the motor shaft used to run. So there's an electric motor in the middle of this. That's what all these windings are right here. And then that spins this guy, which no longer spins the piston because I just actually took the shaft out. Or, sorry, piston would go up and down. But this essentially makes air, and it's oil free, so it's Teflon. So I still have a filter, so I'm not eating Teflon. But I'm thinking that this should be able to drive my Hookah dive setup. Now what I've done is, in order to make this a belt drive, you'll notice this shaft sticks out beyond one end. Sorry. So I put this back there. Eats the shaft on that side, but on this side, the shaft is significantly longer. And that allows me to put this wheel on the end, like that. And so it can be belt driven by a gasoline engine instead of this electric motor here, where you can, like, the original shaft had the what is it, the stator, I believe, big heavy piece on the inside here. So that's been removed and replaced with this shaft, but the original windings are still in here. The windings are heavy, so I'd like to be able to pull those out. But essentially, I've taken a electric air compressor and I'm making it belt drive. And I'll show you a few more details as I assemble this whole thing back together. But we're gonna have a belt driven by a gasoline engine, oil-free air compressor, put some breathing air filters there, throw a mask regulator on a low pressure Hookah diving system, and we can stay underwater a lot longer, if that makes any sense. We have a air compressor project here. I will admit, you caught me halfway through a project. My friend Chris came over when I was taking this thing apart, trying to make it a bit lighter. He's like, Kyle, this is exactly the content you need for your YouTube channel. You're building something, modifying something specifically for gold mining. So you missed the first half, but I'm going to explain everything that's going on here. Sniping for gold is when you swim, snorkel, typically underwater, you're looking for gold. I would like to do something called Hookah diving, which is a supplied air diving. It's kind of like scuba, but instead of a self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, it is a surface supplied air. To do that, you can basically take a generator, buy an air compressor, plug it in, and breathe that air. Of course, if your air compressor has oil in the bottom, just like the same way an engine has a piston that goes up and down and oil underneath, a lot of air compressors run like that. More recently, a lot of air compressors are oil-free, so they've basically just got a Teflon ring. And the quality of these oil-free air compressors has actually gone up a lot. So this particular model, the one I'm working with, is a California Air Tools ultra quiet air compressor model 2010A, so 2010A. This is an aluminum tank, which is amazing. Like, you don't have to deal with the rust issues of a steel tank, and when you're breathing that air, it's something that is important. I will be using a filter after this tank, but aluminum or stainless tank would be key. This comes with the aluminum tank, and it's ultra quiet. So let me just give you a quick rundown of what is an air compressor. We've all seen these. This is a Metabo HPT. It was one of the cheaper, smaller air compressors that exists. This will actually run on my little Jackery 500 power bank. It's specifically why I bought it. I went to the store with the Jackery. I plugged it in. This is the one that would not trip the little 500 watt thing. It actually runs, and it is dead quiet. So let me just show you here. I'm gonna turn it on. So I am speaking in a normal voice. You can barely hear the thing. Super great. And this will just barely keep up with me. So I can take my Jackery, plug this thing into it, and this will run for about 2 hours, supplying me with air. But I can't go very deep with this because it's very little air. And there's limitations to it, but it is something I haven't really actually used yet. It was just, I was getting an air compressor for my own personal use. My only air tool is a brad nailer. Everything else is cordless. This will run that brad nailer, and I just love how quiet it is. The components of this, I'm going to pick up the camera and just give you a quick tour, and I'll show you how this fits in with everything else. Hopefully this makes some sense. All right, so what you have here, this is the tank. Now this is a steel tank. This is that aluminum tank. You can see the size difference. This is the actual air compressor unit. So the way a lot of these things work is you have a motor in the middle, and then that motor spins around in here, and there's a bearing, one over here and one over there, that holds that motor, and then the shaft from the motor sticks out into this side where there's a piston that goes up and down, and that piston goes up and down in here. There's two little holes up top with a reed valve, and a reed valve is just a piece of metal over a hole. And so if you were to blow air in this direction, it would lift the metal, let the air through. If you try to suck air in that direction, the metal hits that hole. So that acts as your one-way valve. It's very, very simple. So basically, you plug this in, this spins around, it intakes air from here. There's just a tube that connects the two of these. So this piston intakes air and then outputs air. This piston also intakes air and outputs air through these two connecting tubes. It puts the air into this tank. This is an electric pressure sensor. So when you get to a certain pressure, it turns off the motor. And then when it gets down to a certain pressure gain, it turns that motor back on. That's if you were using it as an electric thing. And then when you come to this side here, this is where you have your gauges. So you actually have a tank pressure. That's what's in this tank. And then you have a regulator. So I can, if I'm using a tool that only needs, say, 90 PSI, my tank will go up to 120. This I regulate down to 90 PSI, and then my little brad nailer has consistent air at 90 PSI. The tank will start at 120. As I use air, it drops down until it hits that 90, and at that point it turns on the air compressor. But I've got consistent 90 PSI, so my nails are going consistently deep. Now, with the Hookah dive system, I still have my regulator, so I can regulate this outlet. And then, of course, this is my tank pressure. So this is what's actually in the tank, and this is what goes to my regulator. So with a Hookah diving system, it's a low pressure regulator. So in scuba diving, I actually forget what the number is, but you're running like, what is it, 90 PSI, 100 PSI? Don't quote me on that. With a Hookah system, you can breathe on 40 PSI, no problem. So I regulate this down to that 40 PSI, but like I said, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, which is an electric motor run system, and I'm going to take this, is a Honda WX-15. Keen Engineering is a popular gold mining company, and they actually build a unit that has this engine hooked up to their own air compressor system with a belt. So there's no pump on it. It's just this and an air compressor, and you can carry that around, and it's super light, and you can dive with it. It's also very expensive, shipping in US dollars, and so this is sort of my budget way of dealing with things. So because I no longer have this electric motor in here, I'm looking to put a belt drive on this. So that is this guy over here. This is my belt drive. So you have a small pulley on the engine. You put this pulley on the end of this. So you need a way to get the shaft to stick out the end. And then now you have a belt drive air compressor. That's as simple as it is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, which is the larger compressor that goes with that California Air Tools tank. I'm going to show you how I've got this pulley mounted onto one end, and then the actual outlet. So this is the inlet. Air comes in here, and I'll have a little snorkel that takes the air from far away from the engine. This is the pressure side. So basically these two tubes, those mate together. Essentially this intake lets air in to the inlet reed valve here, and this just bridges, so there's also an inlet reed valve here, and then the outlet reed valve, and this is just bridged together with this. These don't run in series, they're just running in parallel next to each other. So pressure comes out of here. Now that pressure plugs in to this tank via this quick connect right here, and if I were to do it again, there's a lot of vibration and this quick connect may wear out because of that. So I might just hardwire this and put the actual quick connect over on this end, whereas this is hardwired here, but that can be reversed later. But essentially, this is my storage tank. This is the reserve tank. So when you take a breath of air, it has capacity in it. This is a blow-off valve. So on this thing, this senses the pressure and it turns on and off the electric motor. I can't do that with the belt drive. So the belt's always running the air compressor. So as soon as this overfills with pressure, this will blow off. And I believe this runs between 60 and 40 PSI. So when it gets to 60 PSI, it just goes, psh, releases some of that pressure, and then drops it down to 40 PSI, at which point this closes. I've always got that steady 40 in the tank, and I can dive off that with no issues. So I'm just gonna set this down here. I don't know if I'll cut all the jerky camera movement out or keep this all together. What's going on here is, how am I actually gonna get my pulley? Aha, there's my pulley. How am I gonna get my pulley to go on the end of this thing? So let me just explain sort of what you've missed in this project so far. This had a motor in the middle. So this is a whole bunch of the windings right here. And that sat inside of this. So just sort of press fit. That's what you got me knocking out when we started the video. This thing weighs, I think it was about 6 or 7 pounds. It's almost the entire weight of this entire air compressor assembly. And this is way more air. This is enough air for 2 divers fairly deep. So knocking this out saves a lot of weight. But the way this thing worked is this is slightly longer than this. And so this basically just butts up against the inside like that, but it can slide around in a circle. However, because this is slightly smaller, it fits inside of that circle perfectly. So it kind of holds everything together. So what I'm going to need to do is, in order to get this back together, I'm going to take this little piece of scrap aluminum. I'm going to stick it on the inside like this. Hopefully you can see that. Just with it sticking out the end just a little bit. I'm going to tack weld it in there. And then if I put like 3 of these in here, those will sort of center this and keep it exactly where it needs to be. And then I can put this all back together without all of this heavy weight. The other thing that was heavy is the piece that went inside of this, where like the inside part of the electric motor would spin around. And that went on the original shaft. Now that original shaft wasn't long enough. So this shaft, well, I'm gonna have to mess with this to get it together again. But basically this was all tight together. The electric motor was in there, everything's running fine. But see how this end has no shaft sticking out and this end does have a shaft sticking out? I bought this shaft from Princess Auto. And what's different about it is this bearing right here. The outside of this bearing is pressed into a, I guess this is like a standard size casting. And so I was able to go to Princess Auto and buy a new bearing. So this is not the bearing that came with the air compressor. I got a bearing that fits inside this hole just fine, with the inside the size of this new shaft. And this is basically just a keyed shaft. And I basically took the new shaft, stuck it in. The old shaft had this electric motor like built in around it. So I just took the old motor and electric motor and shaft, threw it out, bought this shaft, stuck it in. It wouldn't fit in the bearings, so I had to get these new bearings. But now this shaft matches the bearings. It all goes back together. And these little counterbalance things where the shaft goes into, there's like it's a keyed shaft, but I had to basically grind a flat spot on this shaft to go in here. And the only machining I did is the hole in here was smaller than this shaft. So this was a larger shaft. The old bearings had a smaller inside hole. And so I actually had to drill this out with a just power drill, a cordless drill, And so I got it fairly good, but you know, any play and movement seems to be okay. Obviously you could do this better, but I was just trying to be creative and I got that done. So I've got a new shaft now. Whoops. I'm going to stick this thing together with this in the middle after I weld these 3 tabs in there so it can all sandwich together. And what that essentially means is that I now have this shaft sticking out the end, keyed shaft, keyed pulley. I can slide that pulley on there, and that pulley is actually going to, if you can see, that piston moves up and down, just like that. And from the other side, that stays in the middle, and you can see the connecting rod of the piston just moving up and down like that. I feel like I've been talking for a long time, so hopefully that sort of made sense. This is obviously going to be a multi-part project, and you're going to see this thing actually running and me diving with it at some point, probably come winter, because there's just too much other stuff going on. But my little project this evening is I've removed all of this weight. I had this running before on a different engine, and it did seem to make air and I could breathe and all that fun stuff, but I just wanted to put it on this super lightweight engine, super lightweight air compressor, and then I'll have something I can carry into places, and we'll see how useful it actually is. But it's a cool project anyways. I'm going to get to assembling everything, get it to work. I'll show you this once it's all welded up, and we'll finish off the video with this all together, spin the pulley, be like, right, it seems to work. And then in a future video, I'll show you the engine I'm thinking of using. I said Keen Engineering had a setup like this that you could purchase. This is the Honda WX15 water pump. If you want to buy this engine, just the engine by itself, when I went to look, was $100 more than buying the entire water pump. And this entire thing was $689 for a brand new one of these. Now I want to always have one of these. I don't want to just pull my pump off of this and be like, oh, hey, cool, I no longer have my water pump. But I also don't just want to drop $700 on a new pump. So I've owned this since 2013. It works flawlessly. And there's a seal at the back side of this, and that seal slowly but surely can wear out. And when it wears out, well, it's a problem. So I'm going to pull this pump off of this engine to check that seal and make sure that the seal's in good condition, and put this aside over the winter season, at which point I can use this engine to run my sniping hookah setup over the winter. And then next summer, I can either replace the seal if it looks worn, or just put it all back together and be like, all right, everything is working great. Or if I find enough gold along this whole process, I could just buy a brand new WX15, and I'll just keep this engine connected to my air supply system. Yeah. A lot of stuff going on. Let's put this thing together so we can finish off this video before you get bored, and just make sure. Like, really the only thing I'm changing is that I have to have something sticking out of this to keep it centered when it bolts all back together. I've cut this piece so it sticks out on either end like that just a little bit. But if these pieces, just let me put it in place like this, if it lines up with where one of these little metal pieces is, it'll bump into it. And if I don't want it to bump into it, I have to cut it like very precisely so it barely sticks out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this here, and I want it to line up here. Not there, not here, just be generally there. So I'm just going to mark. That's where I want it. And now, step one, I'm going to clamp that into place, drop a little tack weld here and here. Got to be careful not to warp this whole thing out of shape, but that should be okay. And then I just need to find 3 more so it kind of triangulates and stays centered. Aha! Best one yet. All right, show you what's going on here. Yeah. So obviously some nasty stuff there, but tacked in. And essentially all I need is that little lip on both sides. So I'm going to mark 2 more out and weld them in. Okay, so we got her together. This counterweight and piston is exactly the opposite on the far side. There's actually a really interesting, it's basically an Allen key like this that tightens up onto that keyed shaft. On the far side, I had to grind the shaft flat so it had a place to screw into because they have to be opposite to each other. But there's an inner one that you screw in, and so there it tightens itself into place. And I'll give that a really good snug. Let's just make sure she spins all right. That's excellent. And then, I don't know if this is really necessary, but I don't want to mess with it. So we're gonna snug that up real nice. And then to lock it, just the same way on a bolt, if you put 2 nuts and you can tighten the nuts into each other, it locks it into place. You have a outer one of these which screws in, and it screws into the first one, and they both sort of lock themselves so that that goes nowhere. Got a nice little snug again. Perfect. I've got 2 caps. One cap is stock how it came. The other cap I've drilled a hole in. This shaft doesn't stick out, so we're going to stick this cap on stock how it came. There's just 2 of these tiny little screws that screw into the plastic. No big deal. And just so you guys don't have to watch me do it, I won't screw the other one in right now. On this side, again, this plastic cover does not need to be there. There's no bearing on it or anything like that, but essentially you just plug that in and hold it into place. It doesn't fall out. And at this point, what you have is you have this unit. This hunk of metal has been removed, just lifting the 2 of them. This entire thing is slightly lighter than this little guy right here. So that's nice. And basically just slide that on to wherever it needs to be. Once I get this mounted up onto an engine, we now have a belt-driven air compressor. And this is something worth showing. As you'll see, this whole shaft moves in and out very slightly as it spins. It's kind of like, why is it going in and out? And that's just because of the way when I drilled the holes for the larger shaft into the connecting rods. I guess they're slightly crooked, and so they put a little side torque on the shaft, but it does seem to not like bind up, and it seems to work. This video, probably a bit of a mess. Again, if I don't know exactly what I'm doing, I'm not going to be like, this is how you do this exactly. It's sort of a process of figuring this out. But I will be back with this thing running air to breathe underwater at some point. I'll probably head out just snorkeling before that, but I'd like to get this thing hooked up to an engine. And let me show you, where do I have? Here it is. There's your final ingredient, the one I was looking for. So I bought this. It's a 3-stage air filter, so you can drain, water that fills up in these things, and it's for proper breathing air. So even though this is an oil-free compressor, I know some people in other countries will actually use an oil compressor, but they'll put vegetable oil in it as an attempt to not die as quickly. You're still breathing oil into your lungs. So oil-free is good to keep the Teflon and everything out. This is probably the nicest breathing air filter that you could actually get. It's a Wilkerson. Could read you out the model numbers, but essentially it's like a 0.1 microns, or it's like a 0.5 microns, and then a 0.1 micron, and then the last is like a coalescing carbon 0.003 micron. So like super, super fine stuff. It'll take smoke out of the air. That is what I plan to send down to me. Of course, this thing's kind of janked together a little bit. You could fail at any time. I'm not going to be diving very deep. And I think with any supplied air system, it's not a matter of if it's going to fail, it's a matter of when. And so if you're in a situation where you can't just, oh, that was my last breath, drop your weight and pop to the surface, you should actually have a scuba tank with you. And there's like a little valve that you twist to go from supplied air to your onboard air that you would take down there with you. I don't think I'm going to go to that depth because I'm not down like 35 feet, pearl diving in the ocean. I'm basically just screwing around in a river that it might be like 6 feet deep, so I can just sort of stand up and, stand on a boulder and take a breath of air if this thing fails. So that's why I'm willing to screw around with it. That being said, it's supposed to, unmodified, have a 3,000 hour lifespan. So if I can get like a third of that, that's more than enough. Till next time, thanks for watching, everyone. I hope that at least some of you were entertained. Cheers.